She slapped an older server in the middle of a crowded dining room, 40 people watching, and she didn't think twice about it. Sloane Whitmore was 29 years old, wearing a white silk dress, 6 weeks away from the biggest wedding Boston had seen in years. And as far as she was concerned, the gray-haired woman in the faded apron was nobody at all. Just a pair of flat shoes and a rubber band holding back her hair. Just somebody who carried plates for a living. What Sloane didn't know, what nobody in that restaurant knew, was that the older woman she'd just struck across the face was the mother of the man she was about to marry. And the man she was about to marry wasn't a banker or a lawyer or some real estate heir. He was the one name in the North End that people lowered their voices to say out loud. There was only one person who stepped forward, a 26-year-old waitress, with everything to lose. If you love stories about dignity and about the people this world overlooks, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with someone who'd appreciate a story like this one. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we've got a brand new story for you every week. Now, let's go back to the hour before that slap and see how this young mother's life was about to change. The rented room sat directly above the laundromat at the end of a narrow street in the North End. And at this hour every day, the floor always grew a little warmer from the heat rising off the dryers below. June Callahan called it the poor woman's furnace. She stood before the mirror with the cracked corner beside the sink, tying her hair up high and fastening it with the brown plastic barrette she'd used for so long that its finish had worn away. On the wooden table in the middle of the room lay 2 sheets of paper side by side, and both were things June had deliberately avoided looking at directly since morning. One was a notice from the landlord, saying that the rent would go up beginning the following month. The other was the receipt for the deposit on a hearing aid, with the remaining balance still plainly printed on the final line, and beneath it was a reminder for a payment she'd already postponed twice. She turned both sheets face down on the table, then returned to something far more important. Poppy was sitting cross-legged on the old rug in the center of the room, her chin resting in one hand while the other carefully colored with a crayon. She was 5 years old, with softly curling hair and a habit of tilting her head as she drew, as though she were quietly consulting with the paper. She looked up when she saw her mother's shadow move, then raised both hands and signed that the picture was almost finished and Mommy wasn't allowed to look yet. June laughed, covered her eyes with great theatrical flair, then parted her fingers to steal a glimpse. Poppy caught her, shook her head vigorously, giggled without a sound, and leaned her whole body over the paper to hide it. Mother and daughter had spoken with their hands since the little girl was very young, and June had always felt there was something remarkable about it, something spoken words didn't possess. If they wanted to talk to each other, they both had to look at one another. Neither of them could speak while turning her back. Neither could talk to the other over her shoulder. For all these years, every conversation between them had begun with one searching for the other's eyes. Then Poppy lifted the picture and held it out with both hands as though she were presenting something precious. June took it, and there on the paper were 2 people, one tall and one small, holding hands, with a square little house behind them and a yellow window glowing from its wall. The girl pointed to the taller figure, then to her mother. She pointed to the smaller figure, then to herself. After that, she signed that these 2 people would never let go of each other's hands, even when the sky grew dark. June studied the picture longer than she needed to. She kissed her daughter on the forehead, then signed that this was the most beautiful picture of all the pictures in the world, and that she would put it on the refrigerator door, right in the middle, in the very best place. Poppy nodded with deep satisfaction, the sort of nod given by someone who'd just received the reward she rightfully deserved. 3 familiar knocks sounded at the door. Mrs. Ada came in carrying a paper bag of cookies, brushing the fine rain from the sleeves of her coat. She lived on the same floor, exactly 2 doors away, and came over every evening to watch Poppy while June worked the night shift. June took the money she'd set aside the day before from her pocket, placed it in the older woman's hand, and Mrs. Ada made her customary gesture of trying to give it back. June wouldn't let her. This exchange between them had taken place more times than either could count, and it always ended the same way, with Mrs. Ada sighing and slipping the money into her coat pocket. As she did every evening, June carefully reminded her that Poppy could watch cartoons only until the episode currently playing was over. Then she had to brush her teeth and be in bed by the agreed time, with no pleading for a few more minutes. Mrs. Ada said she knew, that she remembered everything, and told June to go before she was late for her shift. June knelt in front of her daughter, straightened the collar of her shirt, then signed that Mommy was going to work and would already be home when she woke up the following morning. Poppy signed back that she knew because Mommy said the same thing every night. Then she took her mother's hand and held it against her cheek for a moment. Their own private way of saying goodbye. June rose, put on her coat, and when she reached for the ring of keys hanging from the hook, her left sleeve slid up slightly. She pulled it down at once, all the way to her wrist, with the careful swiftness of a habit that had long since become instinct. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the fine rain, never knowing that in only about an hour, her life would turn in a direction she'd never imagined. Casa Teresa stood on the corner, about a 10-minute walk through the rain from June's room, and every time she pushed open that heavy wooden door, she felt as though she were entering a place where time moved more slowly than it did outside. Every chair in the restaurant had been worn smooth along the armrests, the wood darkened by all the hands that had rested there over the course of 40 years. Several tiles in the floor had cracked and been patched with tiles of a different color, and no one had bothered to replace them because everyone had grown accustomed to them. What June loved most about the place were the photographs hanging on the walls. There were no pictures of the owner, no awards, no framed newspaper articles singing the restaurant's praises. There were only pictures of customers. A family gathered to celebrate their son's graduation, an elderly couple seated at the table by the window, a group of dock workers posing together after their shift, every one of them smiling, every hand holding a glass. Someone had written a few words in the corner of each photograph. The handwriting slanted and uneven, and many of the pictures had yellowed so badly that the faces could barely be seen anymore. June had once thought that a restaurant displaying pictures of its customers instead of pictures of itself meant either that the owner was a very humble person or that people truly regarded this place as home. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook in the changing room, tied on her apron, then stepped into the dining room just as Ward Denham clapped his hands twice to summon everyone. Ward was the manager, with neatly combed hair, a shirt that was always tucked in, and the manner of a man who was forever relaying someone else's instructions. He announced that the restaurant wouldn't be accepting any customers without reservations that evening because there was a private party. The doors would be locked at 7 o'clock, and anyone arriving afterward was to be politely turned away. Then he added one more thing, speaking very quickly, as though saying it faster might make it sound less unpleasant. All the tips from that night's shift would be included in the bill for the party that had reserved the entire restaurant, which meant none of the money would be divided among the staff individually. The group fell silent. The assistant cook lowered his eyes to the toes of his shoes. The young waitress who'd started the previous month tightened her grip on her order pad. Everyone knew the tips from an evening shift made up the largest part of their income, and everyone knew it was safer to remain silent. June spoke up, neither loudly nor harshly, and merely asked how the work of those directly serving the party that evening would be compensated. Ward spun around to face her. He said that if she had enough free time to ask questions about matters that weren't her concern, he would arrange her schedule the following week so she'd have all the free time she wanted. June didn't answer. She'd learned long ago that some arguments weren't worth winning, especially when the rent was going up the following month. But she noticed something. After Ward finished speaking, he didn't look at anyone. He looked down at the printed sheet in his hand and muttered that the order had come from above, that it hadn't been his decision, and in that moment his voice didn't sound like the voice of a man who'd just won. It sounded like the voice of a man carrying out a task that disowned him. Then everyone dispersed and returned to work. June began polishing glasses, and as she worked, she thought about the small things she'd come to know about this place over her 2 years there. The kitchen window at the back of the restaurant had no iron bars, only a wooden latch, yet in 40 years, not so much as a spoon had ever been stolen. Everyone in the neighborhood might owe money somewhere, but no one owed Casa Teresa a cent, and no one could explain why. There was also a small table set against the wall, separating the dining room from the kitchen. A table for two that was polished until it shone every day, its cloth always lying perfectly smooth, yet no customer had ever been seated there. That evening, the new waitress tried to place another chair beside it, so there would be enough seats, and Ward snapped at her so sharply that everyone in the dining room flinched, ordering her to put the chair down at once. The girl stammered and asked why. Ward didn't answer. He simply said that no guests were ever seated at that table, and that was all there was to it, so she shouldn't ask again. June led the girl away and told her to do as he said, and not question it, because there were certain things in this place that people simply didn't explain. She said that because no one had ever explained them to her either, not even on the day she'd been given a job there, just after her husband died, the man who'd ridden his bicycle to deliver bread to the restaurant every morning. Less than half an hour later, the restaurant door opened, and an elderly woman stepped inside carrying a folding umbrella still wet with rain. Her hair was almost entirely silver, tied neatly behind her head with an elastic band, and she wore a gray sweater with an old-fashioned pair of low-heeled shoes, the kind worn by someone accustomed to standing all day. She asked whether the restaurant needed anyone to help with the evening shift. Ward looked her up and down with the expression of a man calculating rather than considering, then asked how old she was. She replied that she was old enough to know what she could still do and what she could no longer do. Ward asked her name. She said people called her Terry. He asked whether she had any experience, and she answered that she'd worked in restaurants for many years, a long time ago, and that she wasn't asking to carry hot dishes. She was only asking to clear tables and pour water. Ward nodded, because the restaurant was short 2 people that evening, and because the wages for an elderly temporary worker would cost less than those of a regular employee. He told her to go inside, get an apron, and start working immediately. He didn't ask another question, and he didn't ask for her last name. In the kitchen, several cooks glanced at her and then returned to their work. The young waitress who'd started the previous month whispered to the person beside her that with the restaurant this crowded tonight, hiring an elderly woman would only mean having someone underfoot. June heard her, but she didn't say anything. She simply set down her tray, walked over to where the elderly woman was struggling with a stack of napkins, and sat in the chair across from her. She picked up a napkin, folded it slowly so the woman could watch, then explained that this restaurant folded them differently from other places. They had to be folded in half before they were rolled, so the crease would stand upright on the table instead of lying flat. The elderly woman watched June's hands fold the napkin and said nothing the entire time. June showed her where to put the dirty trays behind the counter, where to get filtered water, and where the ice was kept. Then she gave her one more warning, which she said was the most important of all. The step at the kitchen door had worn into a hollow, and the steam escaping from the kitchen kept it slippery throughout the evening. Everyone knew stumbled there at least once, so she needed to remember to step around it on the right. The elderly woman asked whether she meant the right or the left. June stood, led her all the way to the kitchen door, pointed down at the worn tile, then demonstrated how to step around it. When June turned back, the elderly woman was still standing there watching her, and the look lasted longer than it ordinarily should have, long enough to make June feel slightly self-conscious. She smiled, asked whether something was wrong, and the woman said no. She was only thinking that it had been a very long time since anyone had taken the trouble to show her how to do something, instead of merely telling her that she was doing it wrong. The 2 of them returned to the counter. As they arranged glasses on trays, June looked through the window at the wooden sign hanging outside the door, where the name Casa Teresa was painted in blue that had faded beneath years of sun and rain. Then she casually asked whether Terry knew who the Teresa on that sign was, because June had worked there for 2 years and no one had ever told her. The elderly woman kept her head lowered as she arranged the glasses and replied that it was only a name, dear. The sort of name people often gave a restaurant because it was easy to remember. June nodded, accepted the answer, and didn't ask anything more. Just then, the bell above the door gave a dry, abrupt ring, and old Mr. Sal walked in, removing his hat and brushing the rain from it, as he'd done every Thursday evening for the past 30 years. His eyes traveled around the dining room out of habit, and then he stopped abruptly in the middle of the aisle. The hand holding his hat dropped to his side. He stared at the elderly woman standing behind the counter. His lips parted, and a name had risen to the tip of his tongue. June could see it clearly, even though she didn't understand what was happening. The elderly woman looked up. The 2 of them stared at each other across the distance of only a few steps. Then she gave the slightest shake of her head, just once, so faint that no one would have noticed if June hadn't happened to be standing there. Mr. Sal closed his mouth. He remained where he was for another moment, still gripping the brim of his hat, then walked to the corner table beside the window, pulled out the chair, and sat in the same place where he'd sat for all those years. Throughout that evening, he ordered nothing beyond his usual meal, spoke to no one, and kept his eyes fixed on the silver-haired woman moving among the tables, like a man waiting for something that only he knew was about to happen. About 20 minutes away by car, down by the harbor, an old warehouse still had its lights on long after the entire district had gone dark. Inside, among rows of cargo covered with tarps, someone had set up a wooden table and 2 chairs. Seated on one side was a large man named Corbin, the owner of a construction company, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, the kind of man who needed only to clear his throat at a worksite to silence an entire crew. In the chair across from him sat Enzo Marchetti. He wore a black coat and sat with his back straight, both hands resting lightly on the tabletop, and he'd remained that way for almost a full minute without saying a word. Rocco Bellini stood a few steps away with his arms folded, perfectly still. Corbin began speaking first because when silence lasted too long, someone was eventually compelled to fill it. He explained that the investors had been late releasing the funds, that the price of materials had risen, that he was suffering too, and certainly wasn't living comfortably, and that the wages owed to those dozens of workers had merely been postponed. It wasn't as though he'd cheated anyone out of their money. Enzo let him finish. When Corbin finally fell silent, Enzo asked only one question, his voice as ordinary as if he were asking the time. For the past several months, had the grocery bills in the homes of those dozens of workers been postponed too? Corbin didn't answer. Enzo slipped a hand inside his coat and drew out a strand of wooden beads, polished smooth by years of being held. The same beads his father had worn around his wrist until the final day of his life, and placed them in the middle of the table directly before Corbin. He didn't push them forward or strike them against the wood. He simply set them down. Then he said that on Monday morning, when the first shift arrived at the worksite, every worker was to receive everything he was owed, including every dollar from the previous months. When he'd finished speaking, Enzo rose, fastened the button of his coat, and walked toward the door. Corbin remained seated. He was half a head taller than Enzo and perhaps 40 pounds heavier. No one touched him, and no one said another word to him. Yet when he reached for the glass of water on the table, the water trembled inside it, and he had to set it back down. Outside the warehouse, the wind sweeping in from the water was bitterly cold. Rocco walked beside Enzo and asked whether they should have someone follow Corbin for a few days, in case he planned to gather the money and disappear from the city. Enzo shook his head. He said that what frightened a man most was never what Enzo might do to him, but what that man imagined throughout a long, sleepless night, and Corbin's mind would work harder tonight than anyone Enzo could possibly send after him. Rocco was silent for a moment, then said that Enzo's father had once spoken that way too. Enzo stopped beside the car and looked out across the dark water ahead. His father had left him 3 rules, and he'd made Enzo memorize them when he was still too young to fully understand what they meant. Never touch women, never touch children, and never touch people who earned their living with their own hands. Those 3 rules, his father had said, weren't acts of kindness. They were the final boundary separating a family from a pack of wild dogs. Rocco's tone changed as he moved to another subject. He said the Whitmore family wanted to meet again the following week to finalize the paperwork for the harbor project, and they'd also mentioned the wedding. Enzo didn't answer at once. That marriage had never begun with anything resembling love. The Whitmores had permits, connections, and access to doors that the Marchetti family's money couldn't open. Enzo, in turn, possessed what they needed for that harbor district. For 3 years, he'd devoted everything he had to pulling his family out of the darkness his father had left behind. And this marriage was the final step, the closest one, and the cleanest. He only told Rocco to arrange the meeting, then opened the car door. The phone in his coat pocket began to vibrate. Sloane's name appeared on the screen. He looked at it for a moment, then let it ring until it went completely still before getting into the car. Just before 7 o'clock, the wooden door of Casa Teresa opened, and Sloane Whitmore walked in with her friend Bianca, trailing a perfume so powerful that people seated 2 tables away could smell it. She wore a white silk dress, and she didn't remove her sunglasses, even though darkness had already fallen outside, and the restaurant was lit only by warm yellow lamps. Ward hurried forward to welcome them, bowing lower than necessary, then escorted them to the prepared table in the center of the dining room. Sloane didn't sit down immediately. She stood and surveyed the room, taking in the worn wooden chairs and the yellowed photographs on the walls, then told Bianca that the place looked exactly as she'd imagined it would. Old in the deliberate way people preserved something to make it look old. Bianca laughed. June brought water to the table, and Sloane didn't look at her. She merely snapped her fingers twice and said, "You there, bring me sparkling water. I can't drink this." June replaced it at once. When the appetizer arrived, Sloane tasted 1 bite, pushed the plate away, and ordered them to send it back because it was too salty. The kitchen prepared it again. When the second plate arrived, she tasted it and pushed it away once more, this time saying it was bland. The young waitress beside her turned pale, and June took the plate from her, saying she would bring it back to the kitchen and that everything was all right. While they waited, Bianca lowered her voice and asked whether the woman would be coming that evening. Sloane took a sip of water and replied that it didn't matter if she didn't come because this was her restaurant, and once the wedding photographs were taken here, people would assume the family had accepted her no matter where the pictures were posted. Bianca asked whether the woman still hadn't agreed to meet her even once. Sloane set down her glass a little too forcefully. She said the woman wouldn't see her, wouldn't answer the phone, and hadn't even attended the engagement party. All she'd done was send a message through Enzo saying she didn't attend parties. Bianca suggested that perhaps the woman was simply uncomfortable in crowds. Sloane gave a short laugh and said that if she was uncomfortable in crowds, why had she opened a restaurant? She wasn't afraid of anything. She simply didn't want to look at Sloane's face. Then she leaned back in her chair and continued in a voice that had grown calm again, saying that was precisely why she'd chosen this place. If the woman refused to come to her, then Sloane would come to the woman, right in the middle of the restaurant bearing her name, with a photographer and an entire party in tow. Then the woman would have only two choices. She could either appear or let the whole neighborhood see that she was hiding from her future daughter-in-law. Bianca gave a soft whistle and said that Sloane truly never accepted defeat. Sloane shrugged, glanced around the restaurant once more, and added that in any case, this arrangement would last only until the wedding season was over. Bianca asked what she meant. Sloane replied that the restaurant occupied one of the best corners in the neighborhood, yet sold only a few dozen plates of pasta every evening. Leaving it as it was would be a waste of valuable land. After the wedding, she would speak to Enzo, tear the place down, and build something respectable in its place. She said they could keep the name Casa Teresa to preserve the appearance of a family tradition, because tourists loved stories about families. All they had to do was print the name on the menu, and that would be enough. Bianca laughed again. At the far end of the dining room, the silver-haired woman was wiping down a tray. Her hand paused for the briefest moment, then resumed its work as though nothing had happened. No one noticed. Only old Mr. Sal, seated at the corner table beside the window, lifted his eyes toward her, and his expression darkened. A little later, the photographer accompanying them said the light at the center table wasn't flattering, and that the blank wall behind it made the photographs look barren. He pointed toward the corner table beside the window and said that was the right spot. It had the window frame, the glow of the streetlights filtering inside, and the kind of depth a good photograph needed. Sloane turned her head to look. It was the only table in the restaurant with a window overlooking the street, positioned at an angle beneath the old panes of glass. And someone was already sitting there. An elderly man sat alone with his usual meal before him, and 2 glasses of red wine already poured, one of which he hadn't touched. For 30 years, he'd occupied that exact place every Thursday evening, in that exact chair, and he'd continued ordering 2 glasses, just as he'd done when his wife was still alive. Sloane watched the elderly man for several seconds, then turned to Ward and said, "Give me that table." Ward turned toward the corner table, and he understood the problem immediately. He began making excuses, saying the table was a little cramped, that sitting in the center of the dining room was more elegant, and that he could add more lights to make the photographs look better. Sloane didn't bother listening to the rest. She said she'd paid to reserve the entire restaurant for the evening, and she wanted that table. Ward nodded repeatedly, then turned around in search of someone onto whom he could pass the task. His gaze settled on the silver-haired woman standing nearby with a tray in her hands. He called her over and told her to ask the elderly customer to move to another table, to be tactful about it, and to say the restaurant needed his table for something. The elderly woman set the tray down on the counter. She looked at Ward and said that the gentleman had arrived first, that he'd already taken his seat, and that this house didn't force a customer to leave his table in the middle of a meal. Ward's face went pale. He lowered his voice and hissed that she'd been working there for only 2 hours, so who did she think she was? The elderly woman replied that she was only someone who carried trays, but even someone who carried trays knew what should and shouldn't be done. At some point, Sloane had risen from her chair. She walked over, standing half a head taller than the elderly woman because of her shoes, and asked whether the woman knew who she was. The elderly woman said that she was a customer. Sloane said she wasn't a customer. She was the woman who would soon own this place, and an old waitress had no right to stand there and lecture her about how to behave. The elderly woman neither stepped back nor raised her voice. She simply said that if the place belonged to Sloane the next day, then the next day she could decide where everyone sat. But that evening, someone was already seated at that table. The entire dining room fell silent. Somewhere, The sound of a knife and fork stopped in the middle of a meal. Ward clasped his hands behind his back and retreated half a step. Sloane reached out and snatched the tray from the counter, pulling it hard and fast, and the glass of red wine on it tipped over, spilling a dark crimson stain across the white silk of her dress. She looked down at the spreading stain. Then she lifted her head and slapped the elderly woman across the face. The sound cracked through the dining room, sharp and dry. The woman's reading glasses flew onto the tiled floor, and a fracture split one lens from top to bottom. She staggered and caught hold of the back of a nearby chair, her silver hair slipping free from its elastic band. Then there was silence. No one stood up. No one made a sound. All 40 people in the dining room lowered their heads at once, staring at their plates, their glasses, anything except the place where it had happened. 2 cooks stepped away from the serving counter and turned their backs. Ward remained where he was, his hands still clasped behind him, his eyes fixed on the tiled floor. At the corner table beside the window, old Mr. Sal shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly across the tiles. His face burned red, and his hands began to tremble. The elderly woman lifted her head, looked directly at him, and lowered one hand in the smallest of gestures. Mr. Sal remained rooted to the spot for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, then slowly sat down again and covered his eyes with one hand. Sloane brushed at the skirt of her dress and told the entire room that this was a lesson for people who didn't know their place. At that very moment, June set her tray down on the table beside her. She walked forward, but she didn't look at Sloane. She lowered herself onto one knee on the tiled floor, picked up the glasses with both hands, and wiped the lenses with the hem of her apron, slowly and carefully, as though no one else existed in that dining room except the elderly woman. Then she folded the temples of the glasses, placed them in the woman's palm, and gently closed her fingers around them. Only after she'd done that did June rise. She took one step to the side and placed herself directly between Sloane and the elderly woman. Sloane asked who she was. June said she was someone who carried plates there. Sloane asked what someone who carried plates thought she was going to do. June replied that she wasn't going to do anything. She only wanted to say one thing. Sloane could buy the entire restaurant if she wanted, but she couldn't buy the right to strike a woman in the face simply because that woman had done what was right. Sloane stared at her for a moment. Then she opened her purse, pulled out a thick bundle of bills, and threw them onto the floor. The money scattered around June's feet, and Sloane told her to pick it up and get out of her sight. June didn't bend down. She stood perfectly still with both hands resting at her sides, and she never took her eyes off Sloane. Ward stepped between them and loudly told Sloane that he was sincerely sorry and that the matter would be dealt with immediately. Then he turned to June and said she was dismissed as of that very moment, that she was to take off her apron and go home. June looked at Ward. She looked at the elderly woman standing there with the broken glasses in her hand. Then she reached behind her back, untied the apron, pulled it over her head, and folded it, first in half and then into quarters, smoothing it with care as though someone else would need to wear it the following day. She placed the neatly folded apron on the counter. Then she walked toward the door, and not one of those 40 people said a word to her. The door had barely closed behind June when Sloane pulled out her phone. She placed a call, and the moment the person on the other end answered, her voice changed completely, breaking and catching in her throat, the unmistakable voice of someone who'd just been humiliated in front of a crowd. She said she was at his family's restaurant, that she'd been disgraced in front of her friends, that the staff there treated her as though she were nothing, that one old waitress had argued with her while another server had stood in her way, and that her dress was ruined. She didn't mention her own hand. When she'd finished, she ended the call, dropped heavily into her chair, and began dabbing at the wine stain on her dress with a napkin. Bianca sat beside her in complete silence. No one in the dining room dared resume eating. As she waited, Sloane's eyes moved restlessly around the room until her gaze fell upon the counter, where the neatly folded apron was still lying. The plastic name tag remained pinned to its front, and even from where she sat, she could read the small printed letters. She read the name, and her face turned pale. It lasted only a second. Then she quickly looked away, lifted her glass of water, and drank deeply, her hand trembling slightly. Bianca asked whether something was wrong. Sloane said no, then said nothing more. The silver-haired woman remained where she was, holding the broken glasses in one hand and gripping the back of a chair with the other. Ward approached her, lowered his voice, and told her to go sit and rest in the kitchen, that he would handle the situation, and that she shouldn't remain out there. She didn't move. She said she would stand there a little longer. About 20 minutes later, the sound of a car stopping came from the street outside. Then the wooden door opened. The first person to enter was a tall, powerfully built man in his early 50s, who stopped just inside the doorway and went no farther. A second man came in behind him, bareheaded and wearing a black coat, and walked directly into the center of the dining room. No one introduced him. No one spoke his name. Yet throughout the room, chairs began scraping across the tiled floor as one person after another rose to their feet, without a word from anyone, as though the response had been carved into the very bones of everyone in the neighborhood. Old Mr. Sal pushed himself upright at the corner table as well. The order pad slipped from Ward's hand and struck the floor with a dull thud, but he didn't bend down to retrieve it. Sloane sprang from her chair and hurried forward, reaching out to touch Enzo's arm as she began saying that he was finally there, and that he had no idea how they'd just treated her. He walked past her. He didn't stop, didn't turn his head, and didn't even brush her hand away. He simply passed her as though she were a chair blocking the aisle. Sloane froze, her hand still suspended in the air, then took one step back. Enzo walked directly toward the silver-haired woman. He stopped before her. He looked at the red mark across her cheek, at the strands of hair that had slipped free from the elastic band, then lowered his gaze to the glasses resting in her palm, one lens split by a long crack. No one in the dining room dared breathe too loudly. Then the man slowly lowered himself onto one knee on the tiled floor before the elderly woman. The young waitress standing near the counter covered her mouth with both hands. Somewhere in the kitchen, a glass fell and shattered. Bianca remained seated at the center table, looking from Sloane to the middle of the dining room and back again, her mouth open but no sound coming from it. Ward retreated until his back struck the wall, and there was nowhere else for him to go. Enzo took the hand holding the broken glasses and asked in a very quiet voice who had done this to her. The elderly woman didn't answer the question. She raised her other hand and smoothed her son's hair back as she'd done ever since he was a little boy, then told him to stand because the floor was cold. He didn't rise. He asked what she was doing there, saying that she was supposed to be at home that evening. The elderly woman was silent for a moment, then said that over the past several weeks, 3 letters had arrived at her house. There had been no company envelopes, no sender's name, and no signature at the end. They'd been handwritten, all 3 in the same hand. The first letter said that the people working at Casa Teresa were no longer receiving everything they were owed. The second said that some employees had left without daring to explain why. The third contained only a single line, asking her to come back and see what her restaurant was becoming. She said she'd read all 3 letters, and she hadn't wanted to question anyone or call anyone, because the moment she called, they would clean everything up before she arrived. So she'd put on an apron and walked in through the door meant for people seeking work. Then she looked toward the neatly folded apron resting on the counter and said that she'd been standing there for only 2 hours, but she'd already seen enough. Enzo rose to his feet. He helped his mother into the nearest chair, then turned to face the dining room, and everyone who was standing avoided his eyes. He didn't question anyone. He didn't need to, because the wine stain across the white silk dress had already given him the answer. Sloane began speaking first, her words coming rapidly. She said she hadn't known, that if she'd known, she never would have done such a thing, that the elderly woman had argued with her in front of all those people, and that she'd lost control for only a second. Enzo allowed her to finish. Then he said he would give her 1 chance, exactly 1. He told her that tonight, right there, she would apologize 3 times. The first apology would be to the woman she'd just struck. The second would be to everyone working in the restaurant, because they'd been forced to stand there and witness it. The third would be to the young woman who'd been dismissed and sent through that door less than half an hour earlier. Sloane nodded immediately. She turned toward the elderly woman, softened her voice, and said, "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry. I behaved badly, and I hope you can forgive me. I'll make it up to you in any way you wish." Her voice was sweet and smooth, the polished voice someone acquired after years of attending parties. The elderly woman didn't respond. She only looked at Sloane, and there was no anger in her gaze, only a deep and weary sorrow. Sloane then turned toward the staff and said she apologized to all of them as well, because everyone had worked hard that evening. A few people gave faint nods, but no one dared say anything. Then Enzo raised one hand and pointed toward the wooden door at the far end of the dining room, the door through which June had left. He said there was still the third apology. Sloane followed the direction of his hand. She looked at the door, then back at him, and genuine bewilderment spread across her face. the bewilderment of someone who'd just heard something she couldn't believe was meant seriously. She gave a short laugh. She asked whether he was serious, whether he truly expected her to apologize to a mere waitress. The words fell into the dining room with a sound even harsher than the slap from moments before. The elderly woman seated in the chair gently closed her eyes. "Old mister." Sal turned his face toward the window. Enzo said nothing more. He walked up to Sloane, took her left hand, and removed the ring from her finger, gently, without pulling or using force, as though he were peeling away a label bearing the wrong name. Then he walked to the corner table beside the window, where old Mr. Sal was still seated, and placed the ring on the tabletop. Sloane stood frozen in the middle of the dining room, her left hand still extended. She said Enzo's name. She told him he couldn't do this to her in front of all these people. He replied that she hadn't found it difficult to do what she'd done in front of all these people. Then he turned his back on her and called Ward's name. Ward flinched violently. Enzo ordered him to stand in the middle of the dining room. Ward stepped forward, nearly tripping over his own feet, and stood there among the tables beneath the yellow lights, facing every member of the restaurant staff. Enzo told him to recount what he'd done when the incident occurred, and to say it loudly enough for everyone to hear. Ward opened his mouth and stammered that he'd been about to act, that everything had happened too quickly, and that before he'd had time to respond. Enzo interrupted him and said that wasn't what he'd asked. He'd asked Ward what he'd done. Ward remained silent for a very long time, sweat gathering at his temples, then said in a voice so quiet that the people at the farthest table couldn't hear him that he'd stood still and done nothing. Enzo told him to say it again, louder. Ward repeated it, louder this time, saying, "I stood still, and I did nothing." Enzo told him to say it once more. Ward said it for the third time, and now his voice broke. His eyes reddened, and the words rang throughout the dining room. "I stood there. I saw everything, and I did nothing." No one applauded, no one laughed. The entire dining room remained silent, watching a middle-aged man stand in the center of his own restaurant and pronounce judgment upon himself. Enzo allowed the silence to linger a little longer. Then he said Ward would keep his job there. Ward's head snapped up in disbelief. Enzo continued, saying that Ward would still come to open the restaurant the following morning, as he did every day, and he would return the day after that as well. Every morning, when he inserted the key into the lock of that restaurant, he would remember exactly how this moment had felt. Enzo said dismissing him would be too easy, and he had no intention of giving Ward the easy part. Then he turned away and never looked at him again. June didn't leave right away. She'd made it out to the street before realizing that she was still holding the key to her locker, while her coat remained hanging inside it. She stood beneath the awning in front of the restaurant, under a fine drizzle drifting sideways through the streetlight, wrapping both arms around herself against the cold, and she stayed there without going back inside or walking away. She thought about the sheet of paper lying face down on the table at home. She thought about what she would have to tell Mrs. Ada the following morning. She thought about what she'd done, and realized that if she could turn back time, she would do exactly the same thing again. And that was what made her want to cry. The door opened behind her. The silver-haired woman stepped outside wearing an extra sweater and carrying June's coat. She handed it to her. June thanked her, put it on, then asked whether she was all right and whether her cheek still hurt. The elderly woman said she'd spent her life carrying pots of boiling water so she could endure a slap. Then she stood beside June for a while, and together they looked out at the wet street. She said she wanted June to return to work the following day. June turned to her with a trace of surprise and said that the manager had dismissed her and that this probably wasn't something the woman had the authority to decide. The elderly woman said that she did. Then she told June her name. She said the name on the sign outside was hers, that she'd opened the restaurant before June was even born, and that she was sorry she'd lied to her that evening. June stood speechless. She looked up at the faded blue letters on the wooden sign above them, then back at the silver-haired woman standing beside her in those low-heeled shoes, and she didn't know what to say. "Mrs." Teresa continued, saying that beginning that very day, she would pay June twice her former wages, and she would personally arrange June's schedule without going through anyone else. June remained silent for a long time. Then she shook her head. She said that she would be grateful to return to work because she desperately needed the job, but she wanted to receive only the same wages she'd earned before. Mrs. Teresa asked why. June said that when she'd stepped into the middle of the dining room, she hadn't known who Teresa was. She'd thought Teresa was an elderly waitress who'd been working there for only 2 hours. She'd defended a waitress. If she accepted Teresa's money now, then what happened that evening would become an act of defending an owner, and it would no longer be the thing June had done. Mrs. Teresa looked at her for a very long time. The fine rain settled across her silver hair in tiny droplets. At last, she could say only one thing. She told June to go home and rest, and to return at her usual time the following day. June nodded, said goodbye, then stepped out into the rain, and Teresa remained beneath the awning watching until June's figure disappeared around the corner. Late that night, after the restaurant doors had been locked and nearly all the dining room lights had been turned off, leaving only 2 lamps glowing above the counter, Rocco stood beside the table and reported everything he'd just learned. He said the young woman's name was June Callahan, that she was 26 years old and a widow, and that her husband had died in a traffic accident 2 years earlier. The person responsible had fled the scene, and the case had been closed. He said she rented a room above the laundromat at the end of the street and had just received notice that her rent was increasing. He said she had a 5-year-old daughter, that mother and child spoke to each other with their hands, and that the little girl was waiting for an operation their insurance company had refused to cover twice, while June still hadn't been able to pay the full deposit for the equipment she needed. Enzo sat in silence and listened to everything. Then he took out his phone and told Rocco to call the hospital, take care of everything the following morning, cover the entire amount down to the last dollar, and make sure no one told June where the money had come from. Mrs. Teresa was still seated beside the counter with both hands resting in her lap. She spoke then, and her voice was very quiet. She said, "You can buy many things in this world, but don't buy that girl." Enzo's hand stopped. He turned to look at his mother. She continued, saying that June had refused her money beneath the awning that very evening, and now he intended to give her something 100 times greater the following morning. If he did that, he would take away the only thing she possessed. Enzo stood there for a very long time, his finger still resting on the phone screen. Then he turned it off, slipped it into his coat pocket, and said nothing more. News traveled through that neighborhood faster than any car. Before the following day was over, everyone in the North End knew what had happened at Casa Teresa, knew who'd been slapped, and knew where the ring was now resting. Late that afternoon, Enzo received word that the elders of the family wanted to meet with him. The meeting took place in the back room of an old bakery on Hanover Street, a place that had been used since his father's time for matters that couldn't be discussed over the phone. 4 men sat around a long table covered with a plastic cloth, and even the youngest among them was past 60. Rocco stood against the wall behind them. The elderly man at the head of the table spoke first, a small cup of coffee in his hand. He said that everyone felt for Mrs. Teresa after what had happened the night before, and everyone was angry. But now they had to think with their heads. He reminded Enzo that for the past 3 years, the entire family had gritted their teeth and followed his way. They'd closed down their old operations, dismissed some people, moved others elsewhere, and learned to live with far less, all for the sake of waiting for that harbor project. He said the Whitmore family controlled the permits. Ending the engagement meant losing everything. It meant throwing those 3 years into the river. The second man continued, saying that everyone knew the young woman was spoiled, but every woman lost her temper sometimes. Once Enzo married her, he could teach her over time, and after they were married, he could always leave her whenever he wished. The third man, seated near the far end of the table, was the one who said the words that changed the atmosphere in the room completely. He said that when all was said and done, Mrs. Teresa was only an old woman who sold pasta on a street corner, while that harbor was the future of the entire family and of every child and grandchild belonging to the men seated there. Enzo didn't answer with a single word. He set down his coffee cup, then he stood. He didn't strike the table, remove his coat, or raise his voice. He simply walked around the far end of the table, moving slowly, his footsteps quiet against the old tiled floor, until he reached the man who'd spoken. Enzo pulled out the empty chair beside him, drew it close, then sat down near enough that their shoulders almost touched. No one in the room moved. The elderly man at the head of the table set his coffee cup down very gently, afraid even of making a sound. Enzo leaned slightly toward the man beside him and asked in a low voice, almost as though posing an intimate question, what exactly his uncle had just called his mother. The man didn't answer. He stared straight ahead, his throat moving once, while the hand resting on the table tightened into a fist and then opened again. Enzo asked a second time, his voice still just as soft, for his uncle to say it once more so he could hear it again. The man said he'd misspoken. Enzo nodded. He remained seated beside him a little longer, long enough for everyone in the room to feel the weight of the silence, before standing and returning to his place. No one touched anyone. No one raised his voice. But when Enzo sat down again, something in the room had changed completely. He said his father had left their family 3 rules and had made him memorize them before he was old enough to understand what they meant. Never touch women. Never touch children. Never touch people who earned their living with their own hands. He said that the night before, with a single slap, the woman they wanted him to marry had violated all 3 rules at once. Teresa was a woman. She'd been carrying trays to earn her wages, and she was his mother. He said that if he still married Sloane now, for the sake of a few permits, then beginning the following day, the name upon which everyone in that room depended would no longer mean anything, and once that happened, no number of harbors could ever buy its meaning back. No one objected. At last, the elderly man at the head of the table merely sighed and said that they would see what the Whitmore family intended to do. The meeting continued for about another 15 minutes, as they discussed paperwork and several contracts that remained unresolved. While everyone was still talking, the man seated near the far end of the table, the one who'd misspoken earlier, quietly pushed back his chair and rose. He didn't ask anyone's permission, or look at Enzo. He simply draped his coat over his shoulders and walked out through the back door. Rocco watched the man's figure disappear into the dark corridor, then turned to look at Enzo. Enzo had seen everything, but he said nothing. The invitation arrived the following morning on a paper card rather than in a message. It named a restaurant high above Back Bay, where every table looked out over the entire city. Grant Whitmore was already seated when Enzo arrived. He rose to shake Enzo's hand, called him son, pulled out a chair for him, asked what he wanted to drink, and complimented the tailoring of his coat. Grant was past 60, with silver hair combed back and a bright, welcoming smile, the kind of man anyone might mistake at first glance for a kindly uncle who enjoyed telling stories about golf. Throughout the first part of the meal, he didn't mention what had happened at Casa Teresa. He talked about the weather, the price of steel, and a project on the South Shore that he'd just signed. Only when the main course was served did he set down his knife and fork, touch his napkin to his lips, and say that his daughter could be somewhat impulsive at times. She had her mother's temperament, but she didn't have a bad heart. Enzo said he had no opinion about the state of her heart. Grant laughed and nodded, then said that in any case, the 2 families had already traveled quite a long way together. The paperwork had been filed, people had seen their families standing together behind the same project, and if matters like this became public, it wouldn't be good for anyone. He said the harbor licensing office was still waiting on those final documents. Signing them would take only a moment, of course, but leaving them unsigned could last a very long time. He said it in the solicitous tone of someone expressing concern on another man's behalf. Enzo cut a piece of meat, ate it, and set down his knife. Then he asked whether Grant knew whose desk currently held the structural inspection report for the Riverside Tower he was preparing to build. Grant continued smiling, but the smile froze on his face for a moment. He said he didn't remember the name of every official. Enzo said that was understandable. There were so many people, and Grant was a busy man. Then he added that he happened to know the official in question. The man had an older brother who'd spent more than 30 years pouring concrete in South Boston, and Enzo's family still attended weddings and memorial gatherings with theirs. When he'd finished speaking, Enzo lifted his water glass and took a slow, unhurried sip. No one raised his voice. A server passed by and refilled both their glasses, and they each nodded to thank him. Grant slowly turned his glass in his hand, then said he'd always thought highly of Enzo's father. He said he'd met the older man several times when they were young. He'd been an honest and forthright man, but it was difficult to survive in the modern world by being too forthright. Enzo asked what he meant by difficult to survive. Grant replied that Enzo's father had ultimately paid a price near the end of his life. Not everyone was fortunate, after all. Enzo was silent for a moment. Then he said that was true. His father had broken the law, so his father had paid the price, and the older man had never complained about it once. Enzo continued, still speaking in the same ordinary tone they might have used to discuss dessert, saying there was only one thing he found strange. Men like his father broke the law and went to prison, while men like Grant broke the law, called their attorneys, and returned the following morning to dine in the same restaurant, where someone still pulled out a chair to welcome them. He said that if the 2 men were placed side by side, he honestly couldn't say which one was truly the criminal. Perhaps the only difference was which of them could afford to hire someone more skilled at preparing the paperwork. Grant Whitmore didn't answer. He stared at Enzo for a long time, and in that moment, Every trace of the kindly uncle vanished from his face, leaving behind only a flat, cold, empty gaze, the gaze of a man calculating how an obstacle could be removed as neatly as possible. Then his smile returned. He called for the check and said the meal was his treat. When they stood, the two men shook hands. Grant gripped Enzo's hand a little more tightly than necessary, patted him on the shoulder, and said he hoped their two families could continue talking to each other. Enzo replied that he hoped so too. Both men smiled. Then they walked toward separate elevators, and no one in that restaurant knew that a war had just been declared in the middle of dinner without either man raising his voice even once. Sloane didn't cry for long. She cried for exactly one night, and by morning, everything in her mind had rearranged itself into a different order. In that version of events, the person who'd destroyed her life wasn't Sloane herself, but the young woman who carried plates and had stepped into the middle of the dining room to stand in her way. Bianca sat beside her, nodding in agreement with every word, and added that judging by the way Enzo had walked straight past Sloane that evening, something was clearly wrong. Men behaved that way only when someone else was already occupying their thoughts. Those words poured oil onto something already burning. That afternoon, Sloane arranged to meet a man named Trent Sharp at a cafe on the outskirts of the city. He'd worked as Casa Teresa's accountant many years earlier, until Mrs. Teresa dismissed him over several expenses he couldn't explain. He hadn't found a respectable job since, and the bitterness of being thrown out by that old woman remained as sharp as ever. Sloane told him directly that she needed to know everything about someone named June Callahan, and she was willing to pay. Trent asked what kind of information she wanted. She said she needed something that would make people see that girl differently. 2 days later, he called her. He said June's court records from when she was a minor had been sealed and couldn't be touched. Anyone who tried would find himself in serious trouble. Sloane asked why he'd bothered calling her, then. Trent said he'd found something else, and it was even better. He placed a printout from the archives of a neighborhood newspaper that had closed long ago on the table. It was a short article, buried on an inside page many years earlier, accompanied by a faded black and white photograph. The picture showed a 17-year-old girl with her hair tied low, her face lowered and both hands clasped before her, standing beside the entrance of a small grocery store. The article stated that she'd been detained for taking food she hadn't paid for. Her full name was printed beneath it. In the final line, the reporter had added that the girl had lost both her mother and father in a fire about 2 months earlier. Sloane read the article again and again. Then she laughed, a very short laugh. She said the best thing about it was that it was true. If she invented a story, people could dispute it, but this had a photograph, a name, and an issue number. Anyone who wanted to verify it was welcome to do so, because the more they investigated, the more certain its truth would become. Trent asked what she intended to do with it. Sloane said that by itself, the story would only make people feel sorry for June, and sympathy wasn't enough. Something else needed to happen now, so that when people placed the two things side by side, they would make the connection on their own. She asked whether he'd had an access card when he worked at the restaurant. Trent said he had. It was a magnetic card that opened the back entrance and the staff changing room. She asked whether he'd returned it. He was silent for a moment, then said that when he'd been dismissed, he'd left in a rage. No one had asked for it, and the card was still sitting in a drawer at his house. He added that there was no guarantee it still worked, because they must have deactivated it long ago. Sloane told him to try it. That night, after the restaurant had closed, the old card was passed over the lock at Casa Teresa's back door. The indicator light blinked once, then turned green. No one had ever thought to deactivate it. Trent entered the dark corridor, walked through the kitchen, and opened the door to the staff changing room. In his coat pocket was a small object wrapped in tissue paper, something he'd removed from the desk drawer behind the counter that afternoon when he'd stopped by under the pretense of retrieving old payroll documents. It was a wedding ring, its gold worn with age and a few words engraved inside that had faded until they were nearly illegible. Mrs. Teresa had once sold it to raise the money to open the restaurant, and many years later, her husband had gone back and redeemed it. Since his death, she no longer wore it. She kept it in the drawer and occasionally opened it just to look at it. Trent studied the row of lockers until he found the one marked with a strip of tape bearing June's name. Then he opened June's cloth handbag and dropped the ring into the bottom, beneath a handkerchief and several pens. He closed the locker, wiped the handle with the hem of his coat, and left through the same door he'd entered. The entire act took less than 4 minutes. The following morning, When June arrived for her shift as usual, she hung her coat in the locker, placed her handbag in the lower compartment, locked the door, tied on her apron, and walked into the dining room, never knowing that inside her bag lay something she'd never seen before in her life. Mrs. Teresa opened the drawer around the middle of the morning, as she'd done every day lately whenever she sat at the desk behind the counter. She searched beneath the papers, then searched again, more slowly. Then she pulled the entire drawer out, placed it on the desk, and went through every item one by one. When she rose, her face was deathly pale. Ward asked what was wrong. She said her ring was gone. Ward asked whether she was certain she'd left it there, suggesting that perhaps she'd put it somewhere else and forgotten. She said she hadn't kept it anywhere else for more than 10 years. Ward stood in silence for a moment. Then he said that procedure required them to inspect the staff lockers, so everything could be made clear, and no one would be suspected unfairly. His voice sounded perfectly ordinary, but when he reached for the master keys hanging on the wall, they jingled against one another because his hand was trembling. Mrs. Teresa noticed. She watched his hand a little longer than usual, then said she would gather everyone first, because each employee had to be present when his or her locker was opened. Ward said yes, and told her he would take care of it. The entire staff was summoned to the back hallway. The lockers were opened one after another, each person standing beside his or her own, while an awkward silence filled the corridor. When they reached June's locker, she took out her key, opened it, and lifted her cloth handbag onto a chair. Ward asked what she had inside. June said there was only her wallet, her house keys, a handkerchief, and several pens. He told her to empty it. June did. Her wallet fell out, followed by her keys, her handkerchief, 2 pens, and a tin of mints. Then one more object rolled free, struck the wooden seat with a dry sound, and came to rest. It was a worn gold ring. The entire corridor fell utterly silent. June stared at it, and for several seconds, she genuinely didn't understand what she was looking at. She raised her head, looked around, then said she hadn't taken it. Her voice was perfectly calm, without a tremor or a trace of panic. The moment the words left her mouth, she heard them echo in her own ears, and understood that they carried no weight at all, because a ring lay on the chair before everyone's eyes, while all she had was her word. At almost that same moment, the phones of several people in the kitchen began to vibrate. Then more phones followed. Everyone had received the same message from a number no one recognized. There were no words, only a photograph of an old newspaper clipping. Some opened it immediately, while others glanced at it in secret and quickly hid their phones. The image showed a 17-year-old girl standing with her face lowered beside the entrance of a grocery store, and her name was printed underneath. No one said anything aloud, but as June stood there, she felt very clearly the instant the atmosphere in the hallway changed. 2 days earlier, when she'd stepped into the middle of the dining room and stood between Sloane and the elderly woman, these people had looked at her with gratitude. Someone had even told her she'd done well. Now they stared at the floor, at the door, or into their own lockers. The young waitress who'd started the previous month took half a step backward. It was only a small movement, but June saw it. Mrs. Teresa stepped forward. She picked up the ring and closed her hand around it, then said something wasn't right because this girl hadn't taken anything from her, and she knew it. She turned to Ward and told him to put away the master keys because she would uncover the truth herself. Only then did Ward speak, and his voice was that of a man trying to push a burden from his shoulders as quickly as possible. He told her that he'd already called the police. Mrs. Teresa spun around and demanded to know whom he'd called. Ward said that the moment she'd reported the ring missing, he'd contacted the local precinct. It was required by the management company. Whenever property disappeared from the restaurant, the police had to be notified, and he had no authority to decide otherwise. He added that officers were already on their way. Mrs. Teresa stood rooted to the floor in the middle of the hallway. She opened her mouth as though she meant to speak, then closed it again. Half an hour later, 2 local police officers arrived. They took Ward's statement and Teresa's, asked June several questions, recorded the number of her locker, and photographed the ring in the handbag. Mrs. Teresa repeatedly said that she wasn't pressing charges, that nothing had been lost, and that her ring was right there. The younger officer said he understood, but the incident had already been reported, so an official record had to be filed. If she didn't wish to press charges, she could state that in the comments section, and it would be reviewed later. He said it very kindly, and his kindness changed nothing. Once that piece of paper existed, it would continue to exist. When everyone dispersed and returned to work, Mrs. Teresa called June into the back office, poured her a glass of water, and told her not to worry because she would take care of everything. But through the opening in the door, June heard two people in the kitchen speaking loudly enough for their voices to carry outside. They said that if this had happened to anyone else, she'd have been dismissed that very morning. Only someone favored by the owner would be allowed to sit in there drinking water. By the time June reached home, the street was deserted. The lights in the laundromat downstairs had been turned off, and only one dim yellow bulb remained above the wooden staircase. She climbed the stairs with her keys still in her hand and saw an envelope tucked into the gap beside her door. It was white, with the seal of a city agency printed in the upper corner. She opened it and read it right there in the hallway because she couldn't wait until she was inside. It was a letter from the Child Welfare Agency. The letter stated that the agency had received an anonymous petition requesting an assessment of the living conditions of the child residing with her. It explained that according to procedure, a social worker would visit the home to review the situation, and that the appointment had been scheduled for 2 weeks after the date the letter was issued. At the bottom was a telephone number, the name of the person responsible for the case, and a line saying that if the family needed to reschedule, they could call, and another time would be arranged. The entire letter was written in exceedingly polite language. It didn't contain a single harsh word, and it accused no one of anything. That was precisely why a chill traveled down June's spine when she finished reading it, because the letter didn't need to be harsh, it merely needed to exist. She read it a second time, then a third, standing in the dark hallway until her hand began to ache. She thought about the police report filed at the restaurant that morning, and she immediately understood that if those 2 sheets of paper were placed beside each other in the same file, they would tell anyone reading them a story entirely different from the truth. A mother who worked the night shift, a mother who'd just been named in a police report involving a ring, a mother whose name had appeared in a newspaper many years earlier. June raised a hand and covered her mouth. Across the hallway, exactly 2 doors away, the lights in Mrs. Ada's apartment were still on, and Poppy was inside, either asleep or finishing her cartoon, completely unaware of the paper in her mother's hand. June didn't go over there. She unlocked her own door, stepped inside, and didn't turn on the light. She sat in the kitchen chair in the darkness, with the letter resting on the table before her. She remained that way for a very long time. Then she took out her phone, opened her voicemail, and scrolled all the way to the bottom, to the oldest recording she'd kept. She'd preserved it for 2 years, carefully copying it to her new phone when she'd replaced the old one, and each year she allowed herself to listen to it only once, on the anniversary of Danny's death. She was afraid that if she listened too often, his voice would someday become an ordinary sound, and she would forget the feeling of her throat tightening when she heard it. That night, she pressed play. In the dark kitchen, Danny's voice came through, slightly distorted, with the sound of wind and passing cars behind him. He said it was him, that he only had a few more deliveries to make before coming home, and that she should go to sleep and not wait for him. He reminded her to lock the door because the upper latch often stuck and she had to push it firmly into place. He asked whether their little girl was asleep and told June to give her a kiss for him. Then he laughed, the brief laugh of a man in a hurry, and said his final words. He had to go now, and he would see her in the morning. The recording ended. The phone automatically asked whether she wanted to hear it again. June pressed the button to replay it. She listened to the entire message once more. Then she played it again. She sat in the darkness, holding the phone in both hands as though it were something that might shatter, listening to that voice remind her to lock the door, tell her not to wait, and promise to see her in the morning, over and over again. She didn't cry aloud. The tears simply ran down her face while her expression remained still. The way someone wept after becoming accustomed to crying alone in a home where a small child was asleep. She thought about leaving Boston. She considered it seriously. She could go somewhere far away, move to another city, find a new job where no one knew her name and no one had ever read that newspaper clipping. Then she kept thinking and realized that she could leave, but the file would follow her. The police report would follow her. This letter would follow her. And in a new place, she wouldn't know a single person who could say that this girl had never stolen anything from anyone. She set the phone down on the table. The sky beyond the window began to brighten, first turning pale gray, then taking on a faint wash of pink. Downstairs, someone raised the metal door of the laundromat. June remained in the same chair. Only when the dryers below began running, and their familiar warmth rose through the floor did she finally stand. wash her face with cold water, fold the letter, and place it in the lowest drawer, somewhere a 5-year-old child couldn't reach. That afternoon, when June left the restaurant after her shift, a black car was parked a few steps away, and Enzo stood leaning against its door with one hand in his coat pocket. He didn't call out to her. He waited until she came closer before speaking, and asked whether she could spare him a few minutes. They walked together along the narrow street, past several shops whose metal doors had already been lowered, until they reached the stone steps of a small church on the corner. He said he'd heard everything about what had happened the previous morning, and he told her that he believed her. He spoke those words very slowly and clearly, not in the manner of someone offering comfort, but like someone setting something of real weight upon a table. June stopped. She stood there, and then her voice broke for the first time since the night at the restaurant. She asked what good it did for him to believe her. She said no one would take her child away because he didn't believe her. They would take her child because they had papers in their hands, while she had nothing in hers. There was a report at the local police precinct, a letter from the city lying in a drawer at her home, and an old newspaper clipping that half the restaurant had now read. Place those 3 pieces of paper beside one another, and they told a story all by themselves. A story that sounded perfectly convincing. While all she had were the words that she hadn't taken the ring, she asked him to tell her who would listen. She said she didn't need anyone to believe her. She'd never asked anyone to believe her in her entire life. What she needed was the truth, and she needed it on paper, not merely hidden inside people's hearts. Enzo said nothing. He stood there for so long that June thought he might leave. Then he said all right. He said he would bring the truth back to her, and he would do it her way, not his. His way would be faster, but it wouldn't leave behind a single piece of paper, and what she needed was paper. June looked at him. Then she sat down on the stone steps, wrapped both arms around her knees, and remained silent for a very long time. Afterward, she said there was something she'd never told anyone. She said her husband had died 2 years earlier while making deliveries one evening. A car had struck him on an isolated stretch of road near the harbor, and the driver had fled. A case had been opened. Nothing had been found, and eventually it had been closed. She said everyone assumed that was the source of her pain, but something else had kept her from sleeping for the past 2 years. When she'd obtained a copy of the final report, one detail had been recorded there. Investigators had determined that approximately 40 minutes passed between the collision and the first emergency call. 40 minutes. She spoke the number, then stopped. She continued by saying that the person who'd called for help was a truck driver passing through, someone with no connection to what had happened. That meant Danny had lain there alone for all of those 40 minutes. The report also noted tire marks, showing that the car had stopped a short distance from where he'd been found, along with footprints leading from the vehicle toward that spot, and then returning to the car. She lifted her eyes to Enzo. She asked whether he understood. The driver had stopped, had opened the door, had stepped out, had walked closer, had seen him, then had turned away, returned to the car, and continued driving. She said that for the past 2 years, she hadn't been searching for the person who'd struck her husband. An accident could be an accident. The road had been dark and deserted, and someone might not have had enough time to stop. She could accept that. The person she was searching for was the one who'd stood there, looked at him, and left. She said she thought about it every day, and she always wondered whether Danny had been conscious during those 40 minutes, whether he'd heard the footsteps approaching, whether he'd believed someone was coming to save him. When she'd finished, she turned her face away. Enzo sat down on the stone step beside her. He didn't try to comfort her. He made no further promises. He said only that in his world, people claim the person who acts is guilty, while the person who merely stands and watches is innocent. He said he'd believed that for many years, but over the past few days, he'd begun to think they'd lied to him. The following morning, an attorney for the Marchetti family submitted a formal request to the records office for a complete copy of every document connected to the traffic accident that had been closed 2 years earlier, including photographs from the scene and the examination report. The request was received at 9 o'clock in the morning and assigned an official number, and the name of the case appeared in the city's system like any other request, visible there for anyone authorized to open it and see. Mrs. Teresa remained at the restaurant later than usual that night. For the past several days, she'd been preparing for something she'd wanted to do for a long time. Every Sunday afternoon, she planned to serve a free meal to the elderly people in the neighborhood who lived alone, and the first meal had been scheduled for that weekend. She sat at the table behind the counter, writing the guest list by hand, and she could picture every face that belonged to every name. June finished her shift at nearly 11 o'clock. She'd walked half a street away before remembering that she'd left her house keys on the counter. She turned back. Poppy was spending the evening at Mrs. Ada's apartment as she did every night, several blocks away, and had long since fallen asleep. June had just turned the corner when she saw an unfamiliar glow spilling from the rear kitchen window, a flickering orange and yellow light that didn't look like the light from a lamp. Then she smelled it. She stopped in the middle of the street. There was a muffled explosion. Then one of the rear windows shattered, and smoke began pouring into the night sky. Inside June's mind, everything stopped. She heard a siren somewhere far away, and people calling to one another from the upper floors of the neighboring buildings. But louder than all of it was the sound of blood rushing through her ears. For 10 years, she hadn't dared stand near a large fire. At the restaurant, she always asked to exchange duties, so she wouldn't have to work beside the grill. At home, she cooked on an electric stove. When she was 17, the house where she'd grown up had burned in the night with both her parents inside, and she'd been the last person pulled out. Her left forearm still bore a scar from that night, and for 10 years, she'd never allowed anyone to see it. She stood in the middle of the street, unable to move her legs. Then she looked up at the faded blue wooden sign hanging above the door and remembered that the light in the back office had still been on when she left. She ran. She pounded on the front door, but it was locked. She raced around to the side entrance. The wooden door there was jammed, and she struck it with her shoulder 3 times before it burst open. Smoke crashed into her face, thick as water. She lowered herself, pulled the hem of her shirt over her nose, and crawled inside. It was dark and hot, with dense smoke rolling beneath the ceiling, making everything so deeply familiar feel strangely unrecognizable. She called Teresa's name. She called again. There was no answer. She moved along the wall, one hand sweeping across its surface to guide her, counting silently as she did every evening when carrying trays through this room. 2 tables, 3 tables. Reach the counter. Turn left. Glass shattered in the kitchen, fragments crashing onto the tiled floor. She called Teresa's name a 3rd time, and now her voice had grown hoarse. Then she heard it, very faintly, from somewhere behind the counter. A cough. June crawled toward the sound. She struck the leg of a chair, then the edge of the desk, and finally her hand touched something soft, the shoulder of a woolen sweater. Mrs. Teresa lay collapsed on the floor, one hand still gripping the leg of the table. June took that hand. The elderly woman closed her fingers around June's in return. 2 hands found each other in the smoke-filled darkness, and in that moment, it was the only thing either of them knew with certainty. June spoke into Teresa's ear, telling her that she was there, that Teresa had to hold on to her, and that they would leave through the side entrance because June knew the way. The elderly woman tried to nod. June slipped one arm behind Teresa's back, pulled her partly upright, and began retreating along the same path she'd taken inside, reversing the count in her mind. Turn right, past the counter, 3 tables, 2 tables. At one point, the elderly woman's legs gave way. June sank down with her, waited until Teresa could breathe again, then continued. She spoke into the woman's ear without stopping, saying anything she could think of, telling her they were almost there, telling her not to close her eyes, telling her that someone was waiting outside, simply so Teresa could hear another human voice beside her. When they tumbled through the side door, several neighbors had already come running. Someone pulled them farther away while another person spread a coat across the sidewalk. June sank onto the street, coughing until her entire body shook. And still she didn't release the elderly woman's hand. The wail of fire engines carried from the end of the street, drawing closer with every second. Someone poured water over June's hand. Her left sleeve had torn open and slipped completely above her elbow, and beneath the sweeping lights of the fire engines, the old scar she'd hidden for 10 years was laid bare before the entire street. June didn't pull her sleeve down again. She only sat there, breathing, and watched the flames climb toward the faded blue wooden sign above the entrance. Mrs. Teresa lay beside her with her eyes partly open, and she gave June's hand the gentlest squeeze. Near dawn, in a hospital room with 2 beds placed side by side, June awoke to the sound of coughing from the other bed. She turned her head. Mrs. Teresa lay there, the breathing mask removed and resting beside her pillow, her silver hair loose around her face, and she was looking at June. She extended one hand from beneath the edge of the blanket. June reached across and took it. They lay that way in silence for a long time, neither of them speaking, with only the steady rhythm of the machines and the pale gray light beginning to creep through the gap in the curtains. Then, Mrs., Teresa said in a painfully hoarse voice, that she owed June an explanation. June told her not to talk too much, and to wait until she was stronger. Teresa shook her head. She said that if she didn't speak that night, she was afraid she might never be able to say it at all. She asked whether June remembered the small table beside the wall separating the dining room from the kitchen, the table for two where no customer was ever allowed to sit. June nodded. Teresa said it had been her daughter's table. She said she'd once had a daughter. Her name was Marisa, and she was Enzo's older sister. When Marisa was young, she would run directly to the restaurant every afternoon after school, sit at that very table, spread out her books, and do her homework because she said the house was too lonely while the restaurant smelled of fried onions. Teresa explained that for many years, the table had belonged to Marisa. No matter how crowded the restaurant became, Teresa wouldn't allow anyone else to sit there, and eventually it became a rule. She paused for a moment to catch her breath. Then she said Marisa had died when she was 26 years old. June didn't ask what had happened. The elderly woman continued on her own, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She said that in those days, her husband did things she knew he shouldn't have done. She knew everything. She saw strangers arriving at the house in the middle of the night, saw money hidden in paper bags, and watched her husband change his clothes before entering their home. And she remained silent. She told herself that women didn't interfere in men's affairs, that speaking up wouldn't change anything, and that she should simply concentrate on feeding and educating their children until everything eventually passed. She stayed silent year after year, believing that silence would preserve the peace within her home. Then one day, someone took revenge on her husband, and the person who happened to be standing in the wrong place on that particular day was their daughter. Teresa said it very calmly, with the calmness of someone who'd rolled the same stone back and forth in her palm for decades until every edge had worn smooth. She said that since that day, there hadn't been a single morning when she'd opened the restaurant without walking past that table. She cleaned it every day. She allowed no one to sit there. People thought she'd lost her senses, and she knew it, but she never explained herself because explaining would have required her to reveal the rest, the part she couldn't bring herself to say aloud, that she'd remained silent for too long. Her grip tightened slightly around June's hand. She said that was why, on the night she read the third letter, the one containing only a single line asking her to return and see what her restaurant was becoming, she'd sat in her kitchen all night. She said all she'd needed to do was pick up the phone and call Enzo, and he would have taken care of everything in a single day. But she hadn't called him. Long ago, she'd made herself a promise that if there ever came another time when she knew something wrong was happening, she wouldn't sit still and wait for the men in her family to handle it. That time, she would rise and go see it for herself. So she'd put on an apron and walked through the door meant for people seeking work. By then, tears were running from the corners of June's eyes, across her temples, and into the pillow. But she didn't lift a hand to wipe them away. Mrs. Teresa turned her face toward her. She said that on the evening June sat down and showed her how to fold the napkins, Teresa had nearly lost control of herself. In that entire restaurant, in the restaurant that bore her own name, not one person had been willing to stop and properly show a newly hired elderly woman how to do anything. No one, except June. Then Teresa spoke her final words, and her voice was very quiet. She said that if her little girl were still alive, she would be about June's age now. June couldn't speak. She only clasped the elderly hand tightly between both of hers, lowered her head, and pressed her forehead against the back of Teresa's hand. Outside the window, morning had fully arrived. The two women lay there, one having just lost the restaurant she'd spent her entire life building, the other facing the possibility of losing the only thing she had left. And in that room, neither one released the other's hand. At noon the following day, the man who'd quietly left the meeting room at the bakery came to Enzo's home. He placed a thick file on the table and apologized for leaving without saying a word. He said that while sitting in that room, he'd thought that if this boy refused to go through with the marriage, the family would be left with nothing, and if they were going to have nothing, they needed to find something they could hold in their hands when they sat down to negotiate. He said he'd been in this business since before Enzo was born, and it had taught him one thing: never sit down at a table with nothing in your pocket. He'd spent several weeks making inquiries at places frequented by members of the Whitmore family, questioning former drivers and visiting repair shops they were known to use. He hadn't found what he'd originally been looking for, but he'd stumbled across something else. He opened the file, turned to one particular sheet, and pushed it toward Enzo. It was a copy of the records from a private garage that serviced the Whitmore family's entire fleet of vehicles. Among them was a repair invoice bearing a date and license plate number, with a clear description stating that the front left section of the vehicle had been replaced and repainted. The work had been paid for in cash without an insurance claim. The date on the invoice was the day immediately following that rainy night 2 years earlier. The older man said he didn't understand what the document meant. He'd merely found it strange and decided to keep it. Enzo studied the paper for a very long time. Then he folded it and told his uncle to go home and rest because he'd just accomplished something the entire family working together hadn't been able to do. That same afternoon, Ward Denham appeared at the office of the Marchetti family's attorney. He came alone. No one had summoned or pressured him, and he sat in the chair with both hands resting on his knees like a schoolboy called to the front of the classroom. He stated that he'd signed the restaurant's camera system maintenance log, and that during the days before the ring disappeared, the camera in the rear hallway had been turned off. The order to disable it hadn't come from him. He stated that on the afternoon in question, he'd seen a man visit the restaurant claiming he'd come to retrieve old payroll documents, and Ward had allowed him to go behind the counter alone. He gave the man's name. He stated that he hadn't known anything about the ring, but when he saw it fall from June's bag, he'd felt that something wasn't right. Yet, he'd remained silent. The attorney took notes, asked several more questions, then asked whether Ward had anything else he wished to say. Ward remained silent for a long time. Then he said he did. He said he'd written the 3 letters sent to Mrs. Teresa's house. He explained that every month, the outside management company pressured him to reduce labor costs, and whenever he failed to meet their target, they called to remind him. He'd done things that made him despise himself, cutting hours, combining the staff's tips, and threatening the young people who'd only recently started working there. He said he'd known that all he had to do was call Mrs. Teresa and speak honestly to her, and everything would end because she would return immediately. But he was afraid. He was afraid of losing his job, afraid the management company would dismiss him, and afraid of having to explain everything to his wife and children. So he sat down and wrote the letters by hand without signing them, then placed them in Teresa's mailbox before dawn. He said he'd called her back so she could see what was happening, yet when she truly saw it, when she was struck in the middle of her own restaurant, he still stood there and did nothing. When he'd finished saying that, he raised both hands and covered his face. That evening, in the hospital room, Enzo told his mother both stories. Mrs. Teresa listened to everything without interrupting him once. When he finished, she remained silent for a long time, then asked him to pull his chair closer. She said there was something she'd never told anyone, not even June. She said she'd known June's husband. For many years, every morning before the sky was fully light, a young man had arrived by bicycle to deliver bread to the restaurant's back door. He was always on time, and whether it rained or the wind howled, he never missed a single morning. His name was Danny. She said that on some winter mornings, she would open the door and find him standing there with his hands red and numb from the cold, yet he was still smiling. She said that when she'd been gravely ill, during the year she'd been forced to leave the restaurant in someone else's care, Danny was the one who placed an extra loaf in the basket every morning without charging for it. When she asked him why, he'd said it was a gift for her and that she should eat it so she would recover quickly. She said she'd never had the chance to repay him. Then one day, she heard the news. When she learned that he'd left behind a young wife and a small child, she told the manager at the time that if anyone named Callahan came asking for work, they were to hire her, ask no unnecessary questions, and never tell the young woman who'd given the order. Teresa said she hadn't hired June because she was kind. She'd hired her because she owed June's husband a loaf of bread that she could never repay for the rest of her life. That night, 3 cars stood along the narrow road leading into the Whitmore family estate in the western suburbs, their lights extinguished and their engines still running. The men inside them were people who'd followed Enzo's father since Enzo was a boy. People he'd spent years trying to spare from ever having to do this kind of work again. Rocco stood beside him beneath the shadow of a row of trees, both hands tucked into his coat pockets, and he said nothing. He only waited. All his life, a single nod had been enough. Enzo stood there for a long time. He looked toward the lighted windows on the second floor, thought about the blackened kitchen wall in his mother's restaurant, thought about her hand holding his in the hospital, and thought about the invoice for the repairs to the front of the car folded inside his coat pocket. He reached into his pocket and took out his father's strand of wooden beads. He held it in his palm and slowly turned each bead, one by one, just as the old man had always done whenever he faced a grave decision. He thought about that night at the harbor, when he'd placed those beads on the table before a large man and hadn't needed to say another word. Then he thought about something else. He remembered what June had told him on the stone steps, that she didn't need anyone to believe her. She needed the truth, and she needed it on paper. If Enzo nodded tonight, the Whitmore family would be destroyed by morning, but the report at the local police precinct would remain unchanged. The letter in June's drawer would still exist, and she would still be standing there with empty hands. He slipped the beads back into his pocket. He told Rocco to send everyone home. Rocco didn't ask him to repeat himself. He merely studied Enzo for a moment, nodded, then walked toward the waiting cars. Enzo remained alone beneath the trees, took out his phone, and called the family attorney. He told him to prepare the entire file the following morning, everything they had, and submit it to the prosecutor's office. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then the attorney asked whether Enzo understood that when they opened that file, they wouldn't limit their attention to the Whitmore family. Enzo said he understood. Then he ended the call. 3 days later, shortly after June returned from the hospital, someone knocked on the door of her room above the laundromat. She opened it and found Sloane Whitmore standing in the hallway. She wore no sunglasses or makeup. Her hair had been tied back in haste, and she was dressed in a dark coat. June didn't invite her inside. Sloane didn't ask to enter. She remained outside the door and said she'd come to tell June something, and when she'd finished, she would leave. She said she hadn't come to apologize because she knew an apology couldn't change what she'd done. June didn't respond. Sloane said that on a rainy night 2 years earlier, on an isolated stretch of road near the harbor, there had been 2 people inside the car. She'd been sitting in the passenger seat. Her father had been behind the wheel. June reached out and gripped the doorframe. Sloane continued, her voice even and unbroken, as though reciting something she'd memorized long ago. When the car stopped, her father opened the door, got out, walked toward the place where Danny lay, stood there, then returned to the vehicle. He climbed back inside, started the engine, and told her that if anyone asked, she was to say she'd been driving. She said she'd obeyed him. At the time, she'd believed she was saving her father. The following morning, he took the car in for repairs and paid in cash. And from that day forward, he made every decision in her life. Where she studied, whom she saw, whom she would marry. She said she'd lived in that house for 2 years and had been forced to smile every day. June asked only one question, her voice gone hoarse. She asked whether Danny had still been conscious. Sloane fell silent. Then she said she didn't know because she hadn't dared step out of the car. June turned her face away. Sloane said she hadn't come because she regretted what she'd done to June. She admitted plainly that she'd slapped the elderly woman, ordered someone to place the ring in June's bag, and submitted the petition to the Child Welfare Agency. She'd done all of it with a perfectly clear mind, and no one had encouraged her. She said she could endure losing Enzo, losing the wedding, and becoming the subject of gossip throughout the city. But on the night the restaurant burned, she'd stood inside her home and overheard her father speaking on the phone in the next room, and she'd understood what he'd ordered someone to do. She said she'd stood there thinking that an elderly woman was inside that restaurant, and at that moment, she could no longer tell herself that she was merely the person sitting in the passenger seat. She placed an envelope on the hallway floor and said it contained the name of the garage, the name of the person who'd received the money, and the dates. She would give the same statement to investigators and wouldn't retract a word of it. Then she said one final thing. She knew she would have to pay for everything she'd done, and that was only right. She turned and descended the stairs, while June remained in the doorway watching her leave without saying a single word. On the morning of the scheduled visit, June rose very early, cleaned the floor again, replaced the tablecloth, and arranged a small vase of flowers she'd bought at the market at the end of the street. Mrs. Ada took Poppy to spend the day at her apartment because June didn't want the little girl to sit there listening to adults discuss paperwork. The social worker arrived precisely on time, a middle-aged woman wearing glasses and carrying a document case. She greeted June with a kind smile and asked permission to remove her shoes before entering. She said she was there only to understand the situation, not to reach any conclusions, and she hoped June would feel at ease. She walked through the room, took notes, and asked several questions about June's schedule: who cared for Poppy in the evenings, the child's meals, and her schooling. June answered every one. Then, when the woman set down her pen and asked whether June had anything else she wanted to say, June said she did. She said she knew there was an old newspaper clipping in her file, and she wanted to speak about it herself before the woman read it somewhere else. The social worker looked up. June said that when she was 17 years old, she'd stolen something. She'd taken a carton of milk and several loaves of bread from a small grocery store, and she'd been caught at the door. It had happened about 2 months after her parents' funeral. She said she wasn't telling the story to ask for anyone's pity. She only wanted to say that she'd faced the consequences. She'd paid the price for what she'd done, and from that day until now, she hadn't once taken anything that didn't belong to her. She said she worked as a waitress and passed dozens of wallets lying on tables and dozens of coats draped over chairs every evening, yet she'd never touched any of them. Then she spoke her final words very slowly. She said she wanted only one thing: people mustn't use a person's poverty as proof of guilt. If being poor were evidence, then everyone in her neighborhood would be guilty. The social worker remained silent for a moment, then added several lines to the documents in her case. She thanked June for speaking honestly, and explained that procedure required her to interview other people connected to the matter. She had no idea that by that afternoon, people would be lining up outside her office. Mrs. Ada arrived first, carrying an entire notebook in which she'd recorded their schedules for the past 2 years. Every day June had gone to work. Every day she'd taken her daughter to a medical appointment, and every payment Ada had received. She said June had never left her little girl home alone for so much as a minute. Old Mr. Sal came afterward, leaning on his cane, and said he'd eaten at that restaurant for 30 years and had never seen anyone treat elderly people with as much kindness as June did. Mrs. Teresa arrived with her silver hair cut short because of the fire and stated that she owned the ring, that June had never taken it from her, and that she was prepared to repeat those words anywhere she was asked. Ward Denham came in and sat down with the expression of a man who knew he was signing his own sentence with his own hand, then repeated everything he'd already told the attorney. After him came several members of the kitchen staff: the young waitress who'd started the previous month, the dishwasher, and the people who only weeks earlier hadn't dared look June in the face. Some of them wept as they spoke. The case was closed shortly afterward, with the conclusion that there were no grounds for further review and that the child was receiving proper care. June received the letter announcing the decision one afternoon, and after reading it, she sat down on the wooden stairs and remained there for a very long time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, everything was collapsing in a different direction. The file submitted to the prosecutor's office opened a chain of revelations that no one had anticipated. Grant Whitmore was indicted. Construction on the Riverside Tower was suspended. People who'd once shared banquet tables with him began avoiding one another in the street. And just as the attorney had warned, when investigators opened the file, they didn't look in only one direction. Enzo surrendered everything connected to his family's former operations, including ledgers, contracts, lists, and every other record. He spent days at a time in interrogation rooms. Some of the men who'd followed his father all their lives were forced to appear in court. Some went to prison, some fled the city, and some never looked at Enzo again. Most of the family's assets were frozen and eventually lost. The name Marchetti, a name that once made people in the North End lower their voices whenever they spoke it, became after that autumn nothing more than the name of a partially burned restaurant on a street corner. Rocco Bellini retired and opened a small shoe repair shop 2 blocks away. As for Enzo, when everything was over, all he had left was a rented apartment, an old car, and a strand of wooden beads in his coat pocket. They began rebuilding Casa Teresa near the end of that winter. There was no large contractor and no wealthy benefactor pouring money into the work. There was insurance money, there were savings Mrs. Teresa had put aside over many years, and there were people from the neighborhood who simply showed up. The electrician from the next street rewired the building without charging for his labor. Several masons who'd eaten at the restaurant for decades took turns replastering the kitchen wall. Every day, old Mr. Sal came out with his cane and sat in a plastic chair on the sidewalk just to watch them work. Mrs. Teresa preserved nearly everything from the old restaurant. The wooden chairs whose armrests had been worn smooth were refinished rather than replaced. The photographs of regular customers were cleaned one by one, and those with scorched corners were trimmed and placed in new frames. The faded blue sign was hung in exactly the same place, its paint still weathered because she refused to let anyone repaint it. When the restaurant reopened, There was no grand celebration. Teresa simply served the first Sunday meal, and the names she'd written by hand on her list that night, the list the fire had nearly taken from her, came through the door, one after another. They were all elderly people from the neighborhood, some living alone, and others with children who lived far away. They filled every seat in the dining room, ate very slowly, and talked very loudly. Mrs. Teresa called June into the back office, handed her a sheet of paper, and said she wanted June to take charge of the Sunday meal from beginning to end, from buying the food and arranging the tables to deciding who would be invited. June read the paper, then set it down. She said she respectfully declined. Teresa asked why. June said the people at the restaurant had only just stopped looking at her differently, and if Teresa gave her this responsibility now, they would begin talking again. They would say she'd received it only because she was Teresa's favorite. Mrs. Teresa studied her for a long time. Then she said, "My dear, I've spent my entire life fearing what people would say, and I can tell you what it costs. If you refuse something you deserve because you're afraid people will talk, then you've allowed them to decide your life, even though they won't have to live a single day of it for you." June picked up the paper. Then she asked the question she'd carried inside her for a long time. Why had the restaurant hired her back then, when she had no experience and no other place had ever accepted her so quickly? Mrs. Teresa smiled. She said it was because every morning, before the sky was light, June's husband had stood waiting at the restaurant's back door. She said nothing more, and June didn't ask another question. She merely stood there and folded the paper, and it took her a long time before she could finally say thank you. From that day onward, every Tuesday and Friday evening, after most of the customers had gone, a man often came to sit at the corner of the kitchen counter and eat the last meal served that day. He wore an old coat, drove an old car, and no one rose anymore when he entered. He carried a small book illustrated with hands, and sat there practicing one page at a time, making one mistake after another, his fingers stiff and awkward. Poppy loved watching him. Her mother often let her come along on those late evenings, and she would sit on the high stool beside the counter with her chin in her hands, watching him practice. One evening, when he tried to sign the word sorry, he placed his hand in the wrong position. The little girl giggled, slid down from her stool, ran over, pulled his hand lower, placed it correctly in the center of his chest, then guided his wrist in a circle. He tried again. She shook her head and corrected him once more. He tried one more time. When he finally did it correctly, she clapped twice and raised her thumb in approval. Mrs. Teresa watched from behind the kitchen, still holding a dish towel in one hand, and she didn't say a word. One Sunday evening, when every seat in the dining room was occupied, Poppy stood in the aisle clutching her drawing book because she didn't know where to sit. Mrs. Teresa walked over, took the little girl's hand, and led her to the small table beside the wall separating the dining room from the kitchen, the table for two where no one had been allowed to sit for all those years. Teresa pulled out a chair. She placed Poppy's drawing book on the tabletop, smoothed the cloth, then awkwardly signed with the few words she'd only recently learned that Poppy could sit there. Poppy climbed onto the chair, opened her book, and began to draw. Mrs. Teresa stood watching her for a moment, then turned and walked back into the kitchen. And no one in the restaurant that evening understood why her eyes had filled with tears. The surgery took place on an early spring morning, and several weeks later came the appointment to activate the device. The small hospital room held one table, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking a row of trees just beginning to put out new leaves. The technician warned June not to expect too much the first time. Some children needed several weeks before they began distinguishing sounds, while others initially experienced discomfort from the unfamiliar sounds and cried. And that was normal too. June nodded and said she understood. She sat in the chair facing her daughter, their knees touching. Poppy sat patiently with her legs swinging and her drawing book held against her chest as always. The technician adjusted something on the computer, then looked up and nodded. June gazed at her daughter. She opened her mouth and realized that her hands were trembling. She'd spoken to her child with her hands for so many years, and now she didn't know which word to begin with. At last, she simply called her daughter's name, very softly, only once. Poppy stopped swinging her legs. She frowned and turned her head to one side as though searching for something behind her, then looked back at her mother with wide eyes and an expression of complete bewilderment. June called her name again. The little girl stared at her mother's mouth. Then she raised both hands and covered her ears, uncovered them, and covered them again, repeating the motion as though testing a game she'd only just discovered. And suddenly, she laughed. She burst into the bright, ringing laughter of a child who'd encountered a miracle she didn't yet know how to name. She leaned forward, wrapped both arms around her mother's neck, and brought her mouth close to June's ear as though afraid the wonderful thing that had just happened might disappear if she spoke too loudly. Then, in a distorted, hoarse voice that was barely more than a breath, she said, "Mommy." June held her daughter tightly. For months, that woman hadn't cried. She hadn't cried when she was dismissed in the middle of the restaurant, hadn't cried when the ring fell from her handbag, and hadn't cried when she stood in the dark hallway holding the city's letter. But there, in that small room with a window overlooking trees putting out their first leaves, she collapsed against her daughter's shoulder and wept aloud, her entire body shaking, while the technician had to turn away and wipe her glasses. That afternoon, mother and daughter sat on the steps outside the hospital. June took out her phone, opened the oldest recording she still possessed, placed it in her daughter's palm, then signed for her to listen because this was her father. Poppy held the phone to her ear, and in the afternoon sunlight, a child heard her father's voice for the first time in her life, the voice reminding her mother to lock the door, telling her not to stay awake waiting, and promising to see her the following morning. The little girl listened to the entire message once, then pressed the button to replay it, and then played it again, just as her mother had once done in an unlit kitchen. 1 year later, several rows of tables were arranged in the courtyard behind Casa Teresa for a small wedding. There were no reporters, no photographers, and no guests whose names the bride and groom didn't know. The first table, the one closest to the newly married couple, was reserved for the head chef, the dishwasher, Mrs. Ada, and old Mr. Sal, who sat leaning on his cane and smiled throughout the celebration. Mrs. Teresa sat nearby with her silver hair neatly combed and the old ring once again on her finger. Poppy ran among the tables, occasionally stopping to speak aloud with one person or another, then turning to speak with her mother through her hands, and both ways felt equally natural to her. In her hands was a new drawing. It still showed two people holding hands before a house with a yellow window, but this time, the mother in the picture had been given a smiling mouth. On the wall inside the restaurant, beside the yellowed photographs of familiar customers, a new glass frame had been hung. It contained no photograph, only a faded apron folded neatly into quarters, exactly as it had been placed on the counter on the night when no one had dared to speak. This story leaves us with several very simple truths. People's worth isn't found in the uniform they wear, the work they do, or the amount of money they carry in their pockets. True kindness is what people offer when no one is watching, when no reward is waiting, and when the person before them has nothing to give in return. And perhaps the most important truth to consider is this: evil rarely wins simply because it's strong. It wins because too many people around it choose to lower their heads and remain silent. So be kind to those who serve you, and speak up for someone who is being treated unjustly, because sometimes a single person willing to step forward is enough to change an entire life. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and share it so we'll have even more encouragement to bring you meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always enjoy good health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.